It's time to dive into the deep clue sea with Morska at the head of this deck. It's time for thematic upgrades for murders at Karlov Manor's Precon that is all about the clues. So as I said, this deck is all about the clues and is headed up by Morska Undersea Sleuth. For a green, a white, and a blue, you get a Vidalcan Fish Detective. It's a 2/3 that says you have no max hand size. At the beginning of your upkeep, investigate, and whenever you draw your second card each turn, put 2+1/+1 counters on Morska. So this is actually built to be more like a Voltron commander. Now, for those that don't know what a Voltron commander is, anytime you deal 21 or more combat damage to one of your opponents, they lose the game. I call it blackjacking your opponents since 21 is blackjack. So what happens then is they lose, and then you can move on to trying to do the same thing to another one of your opponents. The only problem is you're dumping all your eggs into a singular basket trying to do that, which a good shot at a removal spell or a board wipe or anything like that you can't prevent is gonna screw your plans all to hell. But what I like about Morska here is we have plenty of card draw that allows us to kind of recover in case of those kind of things. We do have some spells to protect her from getting blown up. And there's just a lot of things going on in this deck that actually make it so you can make her unblockable and smash somebody in the face for enough damage to take them out. The alternate commander in this deck is Sophia Dogged Detective. For 1, a green, a white, and a blue, you get a 3/4 human detective that when it enters, you create a 2/2 legendary green dog detective creature token named Tiny. She also has pay 1 and sack an artifact token, all these clues we're making, to put a +1/+1 counter on each dog you control, and whenever a dog you control deals combat damage to a player, create a food token, then investigate. So this is a great commander, and I want to build a deck around it, but for the purposes of these thematic upgrades, there's just not enough dogs in the Ravnica world that were created that we can actually take advantage of this as a secondary version of the deck, and there's no enchantments or artifacts that turn all of our creatures into dogs for us to take advantage of the putting +1/+1 counters on all of our dogs. So don't worry, we are going to circle back to Sophia in a different video, but it's going to be a non-Ravnica themed deck in order to make it really fun. But clues are not the only thing we get to look forward to in this deck. This deck is actually chock full of decent reprints, especially some expensive ones. But we're also going to remove some of those expensive reprints because they do not fit the world of Ravnica, which is one of my ground rules for these thematic upgrade videos. So let's start with those removals, and starting with probably the most expensive card in the deck, Adrix and Nev Twin Casters. While I love the ability to double my tokens when I'm messing around with a deck that's about tokens, this unfortunately just doesn't fit because these guys are from the Strixhaven Academy on Arcavios. We're also going to take out Alondra Sky Dreamer. Again, cool thing with tokens, but unfortunately she's from Chandalar, so she does not fit what my parameters are for this deck. Same thing here with Benny Brack's Zoologist. Great card. You create tokens to draw and you get to draw cards, but he's from New Capenna, so he does not fit the mold of what I want to do with this deck. Same thing with Chilean Teller of Tales. He's great for, creating card draw abilities for us. However, he's from the world of Eldraine, and on top of that, I do not like this card one bit. It is way too powerful and can just overtake a game by itself. And if I want to run this card in the deck, I'd run it at the front instead of in 99 of the deck. And the same reason as Adrix and Nev getting pulled out, Essex Fractal Bloom's getting pulled because it's another Strixhaven card. So let's see if I don't butcher this name. Jorel Monvuli Recluse is getting pulled because she's from Dominaria, not Ravnica. And once again, Coma Cosmo Serpent is also getting pulled because it's from Kaldheim, not Ravnica. And it's also a very overpowered and very annoying card to deal with. And then the last legend we're going to pull out of this deck is Selvala Explorer Return because, again, she's from a different plane. She does not belong here on Ravnica. Then we're going to move on to some cards that can get pulled out of the deck. First up is Finale of Revelation. Now, this works just fine because this took place in Ravnica during the War of the Spark. However, I don't like this card in this deck. We already have a ton of card draw in other avenues, so I'd rather take this out to fit other things into the deck. Now, while the next card actually fits the theme of being able to allow us to draw a card if you created a token, Idol of Oblivion creates an Eldrazi with its second activated ability, and Eldrazi do not belong in this world either, so therefore I'm going to take it out of the deck. And then we're also going to remove Nettlecyst from the deck because it's a Phyrexian living weapon, and the Phyrexians are shut down at this point in the story, and we don't want to have them in our deck. And that also means Psychosis Crawler gets the cut here too because it is a Phyrexian monster, and all the Phyrexians are shut down except for the Planeswalkers that didn't turn back. So this thing shouldn't be in here either. I'm also going to pull the copy of Teferi's Ageless Insight out here, basically because it has Teferi's name on it, and he's no longer able to planeswalk unless he jumps on an Omen Path somewhere. So I'm not going to have this card in there either. And since they name dropped a location on Innistrad in the next card, Ulenwald Mysteries is getting pulled from the deck. Because again, I'm trying my hardest to make sure we don't include things that would show up somewhere else in another plane. And another thing that would show up on another plane is the Kappa Cannoneer. This is from Kamigawa, and it just doesn't fit. The Turtle Warriors, Turtle whatevers, don't show up as one of the official creature types that live on Kamigawa, so I can't, in my mind, justify leaving it in the deck for the purposes of this upgrade. And then the last removal that deals with name drops is Erdwall Illuminator. It's a great card in this deck, gives you additional investigates whenever you investigate the first time on a turn. But unfortunately, Erdwall is a location on Innistrad, and I want to cut it out for that very reason. And then our last 3 cuts are going to be not because of location or name dropping, but more because I don't feel they fit the deck very well. The first up is Organic Extinction. Now, this is a great card because it has Improvise. You can tap your clue tokens to pay for it, and it says destroy non-artifact creatures. The problem is there's not a ton of actual artifact creatures in this deck. You're not creating a ton of them either. So it's kind of hard for me to justify going ahead and using this, because then the only way you really get the good mileage out of this is to combine it with one of the new cards that came in the deck, and it's kind of a narrow case that you could use it and not screw yourself in the process. I'm also going to remove Killer Service. Now, this works great with the clues because when you pay 2 at the end step and you sacrifice it, you can create a Rhino Warrior. The problem is on Ravnica, Rhino Warriors in particular do not exist. There are rhinos in the wild according to the lore, but not humanoid versions of them. So for that reason, I went ahead and pulled the card out. And then the last cut I'm going to make here is Tezzeret, Betrayer of Flesh. Now, this is a great card in the deck, and you can, find your justifications for wanting to keep it. But I don't know if he's still considered a planeswalker or if he has been desparked into just being a creature in the story. So for that reason alone, I'm going to go ahead and leave him out of the deck, but you could have justification because he has been to the plane. He was the one who opened the Planar Bridge and allowed the Dread Horde to come in and mess up stuff during the War of the Spark. But for this purpose of this upgrade, he's going to get punted out. So with all those removals, I did leave most, if not all, of the new cards going in, and I've added a bunch there that belong to the new main set as well. So let's take a look at the new cards that have never been printed before from the Precon before we go into what I'm adding into the deck to round it out. First is Detective of the Month for 2 and a blue, Human Detective 2/3 with Ascend, which means as long as you have 10 permanents, you get the City's Blessing for the rest of the game. And as long as you have the City's Blessing, detectives you control can't be blocked, which makes this perfect for Morska, because then you can punch through and hit your opponents really freaking hard. And the Detective of the Month also has, whenever you draw your second card each turn, create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token. So if Morska gets shut down by single target removal spells, this can still pump out multiple blue little two blue and white detective creature tokens, along with the other detectives we have in the deck, to kind of finish our opponents off in the long run. Speaking of other detectives, we have our first Centaur detective, an Innocuous Researcher for 3 and a green. It's a 3/4 with Parlay. It says whenever it attacks, each player reveals the top card of their library. For each non-land card revealed this way, you investigate, and then each player draws a card. So at the beginning of your end step, you may untap all lands you control, and if you do, you can't cast spells until your next turn. So this is almost like a fixed variation of Wilderness Reclamation, where it costs the same amount as the Reclamation. It's a lot easier to kill than a Reclamation, but if you want to use that untap ability to, get your mana back, you can't cast spells. However, you can do that to untap your stuff and start cracking clues open on your opponent's turn to gain the benefits of the once per turn triggers or the draw 2 triggers or whatever. So these are pretty good things going on with this particular researcher, and I kind of want to see how good this really is in this deck. Then we have a card that everybody's talking about, and that is Merchant of Truth for 2 white, 2/5 Angel Detective with flying. Whenever a non-token creature you control dies, investigate. Clues you control have Exalted. Now this may not make a ton of sense because Exalted is usually on a creature and it gains it attacks alone, it gets +1/+1 for attacking. But if all of your clues have Exalted, whenever a creature attacks by itself, the creature's going to get +1/+1 and for each instance of Exalted on your permanents. So if you have 5 clues out and you swing with a single creature like your commander and it's unblockable, it's going to get +5/+5 just from the Merchant of Truth, granting Exalted to those clues. And the sky's the limit depending on how many clue tokens you have on the board. So this card is very powerful in this deck. Then we have a card that matches up really well with the Blame Game deck. It's Serene Sleuth. For 1 and a white, you get a 2/2 human detective that when it enters, you investigate. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, investigate for each goated creature you control, and then each creature you control is no longer goated. So you can go ahead and, you hit the combat step, and if somebody goated your board with like a Disrupt Decorum or something like that, your stuff's no longer goated. You don't have to force them into combat, and you can go after the person who goated all your stuff instead, and you're going to get a nice little pile of tokens for your trouble. Now, remember I said there was an edge case for the use of Organic Extinction? Well, the next card is the reason why, and that is Tangle Trove Kelp. For 5 blue, it's a 6/6 clue plant that has Ward 2, and at the beginning of each combat, your clues, other than itself, become 6/6 plant creatures in addition to their other types until end of turn, and you can pay 2 and sack it to draw a card just like any other clue. So if you have a board full of clues, this is like your Craterhoof Behemoth for the deck. You can slam this down at the beginning of your combat. They all become 6/6s and you can run somebody over. Or in this case, you would turn them into 6/6 creatures, and this thing is an artifact creature itself. So the Organic Extinction wouldn't kill this or the clue creatures. But unfortunately, it's such a fringe case that I just can't justify running it over a different board wipe. Next is the return of an ability that has only ever been printed on one other card in the entire history of the game, and this is Follow the Bodies. For 2 and a blue, it has a Gravestorm, which is the ability I was talking about. It says when you cast a spell, copy it for each permanent put into the graveyard from the battlefield this turn, investigate. So it just investigates for 2 and a blue if nothing else happens. But ideally, you're breaking a bunch of stuff, your stuff's dying, a board wipe happens, whatever, and then you go ahead and fire this off and get all the good stuff off of it and stack up a bunch of investigating tokens as you go along. And as I was researching this video, I realized now there is actually a ransom note in all 4 of the precons, and each one of them actually has its own unique art attached to that precon. So I made sure to grab the one that went with this one. So if you don't remember what I talked about yesterday, or if you haven't seen that video yet, ransom note, 1 colorless artifact clue. When it enters, you surveil 1, and then you can pay 2 and break it. And it says either cloak the top card of your library, goad target creature, or draw a card. All in all, it's just a great all-around good card, and it works perfectly in this deck, and I like it, so I'm going to keep it in. And then the last few cards that are new here are some pretty powerful enchantments that they put in the deck. First up is Armed with Proof. For 2 and a white, you get an enchantment that when it enters, you investigate twice, and then clues you control are equipment in addition to their other types and equipped to a creature for giving it +2/+0 and equips for 2 colorless. So if you have a bunch of stuff lying around in clues and you have the ability to pay and dump these onto a creature, your commander would be ideal here, then you can give it a +2/+0 boost with turning them all into equipment. So this is pretty strong. Then there's On the Trail. For 1 and a green, it's an enchantment. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. So this is almost like a variation on Burgeoning that says whenever your opponents play a land, you get to do the same thing from your hand. Well, in this case, it's drawing your extra cards. So as you're breaking these clue tokens open and messing with that, you get some good mileage as long as you're drawing the cards and then you're able to get a land. You can just plop it right onto the battlefield and just do that over and over and over again. So you're going to get ahead on mana good this way as well. And then the last new card that we're keeping in here is Knowledge is Power. For 3 white blue enchantment. Creatures you control get +X/+X, where X is the number of cards you've drawn this turn. So if you're able to mass crack clues open and you have a bunch laying around or any other card draw stuff that you got going on, this can give a big finishing boost to your go wide strategy or a strategy of getting Morska built up big enough to knock somebody out in 1 hit. So we've seen the removals and we've seen the new cards that are in the deck that I wanted to keep around. So what am I adding into this to make it still function and be completely Ravnica flavored? Let's take a look. For this, you're going to see a very healthy dose of the brand new cards coming from Murders at Karlov Manor. So let's start off with one of the big names in there, Alquist Croft Master Sleuth. For 1, a white and a blue, you get a 3/3 human detective with vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, investigate, and then you can pay X white, blue, blue, and tap it and sack a clue. You draw X cards and gain X life. So talk about those ways that burst in extra draw. This is a great way to do it. It also helps pad our life total if we need to for various reasons. And we're going to have plenty of clues lying around to sacrifice and feed into this and draw all these cards. We're also going to include the fairy focus of this set, Kellen Inquisitive Prodigy. For 2, a green and a blue. You get a human fairy detective with an adventure of Tale of a Suspect, green, blue. Investigate. You can play an additional land this turn, so it's kind of like another variation on Growth Spiral. And then it becomes a 3/4 creature when you put it on the board with flying and vigilance. And whenever it attacks, destroy up to 1 target artifact. If you control the permanent, draw a card. So, blow up one of your own clue tokens, and it's basically crack a clue for free and get the card off of it. And then it also goes ahead and you have all these other stuff laying around, or you can just blow up something your opponent may have. Maybe there's something really problematic you need to get rid of. Well, he can take care of it for us. We're also going to include another main character from the lore, and that is Ezram, Agency Chief. For 1 blue, blue, white, white, you get an Archon Detective. It's a 5/5 flyer that when it enters, investigate twice, and you can pay 1 and sack an artifact, and it gives him Vigilance, Lifelink, or Hexproof until end of turn. So he becomes a nice little threat that's hard to remove because we're going to have all kinds of clues to sacrifice and keep him alive with the Hexproof. He can pad our life total. He can stand by on defense as well as offense for us, as long as we feed in the clue tokens to his abilities and have a mana available to activate it every time. I'm also going to add one of the Ravnica Clue Edition commander availabilities here, and that is Lannis, Genetics Expert. For 1 and 2 hybrid Simic. Is a Snake Elf Detective, a 1/2 with Evolve. So whenever a creature with greater power or toughness enters the battlefield, you put a counter on Lannis. When a counter is put on Lannis, you investigate for however many counters are put on him. And when you sack a clue, put a counter on another target creature you control. I figured since we have the original version of Lannis, the Cryptozoologist, we'd go ahead and put the Genetics Expert version in here. Just keep in mind that the Ravnica Clue Edition does not release until the end of the month, so you're not going to be able to get an actual copy of this if you want it, instead of just proxying it in the deck instead. I'm also including the very funny card, Private Eye. For 1, a blue and a white. It's a 3/3 Homunculus Detective. Other detectives get +1/+1. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, target detective can't be blocked this turn. This works out beautifully for our commander damage plan, because then you can make Morska an unblockable detective and smack our opponents around by just drawing for your turn and cracking a clue or whatever else we have going on for card draw. And with our heavy need for all of these clues, I'm including Wojek Investigator. For 2 and a white, Angel Detective, Flying Vigilance 2/4. At the beginning of your upkeep, investigate once for each opponent who has more cards in hand than you. So as long as your opponents are, you keep your hand down, you're going to get extra clues off of the Wojek Investigator, and you're able to use that to feed what we're doing in the deck. We're also going to include Forensic Gadgeteer. For 2 and a blue. It's a 2/3 Vidalcan Artificer Detective. Whenever you cast an artifact, you get to investigate. Now, we're not going to get to use that a whole lot because there's not a ton of artifacts in the deck. I mostly included it for the second half of its abilities. Activated abilities of artifacts you control cost 1 less to activate. This effect cannot reduce the mana cost to less than 1. But that's fine, because the big thing here is you're cutting in half the activation cost of the clue tokens, which are kind of like the bread and butter of this deck. So this makes for a great addition here, and I hope that my hunch on this is right, that we don't need the front half so much as we need the back half. And then dipping back into past sets, I wanted to put a copy of Plaxcaster Frogling in the deck. For 1, a green and a blue. It's a 0/0 Frog Mutant with Graft 3. That means it enters with 3 counters on it. You can pay 2. Target creature with a +1/+1 counter on it gains Shroud until end of turn. So the big reason I wanted to include this here is I needed some protection to keep Morska alive. So with this, as long as it's on the board, you can pay 2, and a target creature with a counter on it gains Shroud. So we can protect her from targeted removal by just giving her Shroud, because she's going to have counters on her as long as you've been breaking clues open on your turn or using any of your other card draw spells. Then we'll move over to the instants and sorceries that I added to the deck. I only added 1 sorcery, but it was to replace Organic Extinction. I wanted to include a copy of No Witnesses from the new set. For 2 white, white. Each player who controls the most creatures investigates, then destroy all creatures. This is a little more reliable if we need a board wipe to kind of clean up the board and do things with. And on top of that, it does investigate for us as long as we have more creatures than anybody else. So it fits the theme of the deck quite well. And since we're in the clue realm, we're going to go ahead and add in Officious Interrogation. For a blue-white, you get an instant. It costs blue-white more to cast for each target beyond the first. Choose any number target of players. Investigate X times, where X is the total number of creatures those players control. So you can get a very, very large burst of clue tokens off of this just by having this and having, 4 to 6 mana available to go ahead and target these opponents. And since we're trying to make Morska big and bad so we can start knocking opponents out quickly, I also included Repulsive Mutation for X and green-blue. It's an instant. Put X counters on target creature you control, then counter up to 1 target spell unless its controller pays mana equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. So ideally, Morska is going to be our biggest creature. We're just going to dump more counters onto her. And then if they can't pay whatever her power is, they're not going to get their spell. So the board wipe they just cast or the removal spell or whatever is just going to be like, no. And then since we really need to keep her alive, I wanted to include one more thing in there to kind of keep her off the stuff off of her. And that is Assure Assemble. From the last time we were in Ravnica. You get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature and give it indestructible for 2 Selesnya hybrid on the Assure side. And then the Assemble side is 4 green-white, create 3/2/2 white and green elf knight tokens with vigilance. I really don't care about that side of the card. You can use it in a pinch. The big thing here was the Assure side to give us some form of protection besides the other 2 or 3 spells we have in the deck. Then I wanted to add one more artifact to the deck, but the one I wanted to add didn't do what I wanted to. I wanted to add Cryptic Coat, but it can't equip to Morska because I didn't read it correctly. However, we can add in Magnetic Snuffler for 5 colorless. You get a 4/4 construct that enters the battlefield. Return target equipment card from your graveyard to the battlefield attached to this, which does not really have much bearing for us. It's the other part that interests me. Whenever you sack an artifact, put a counter on it. So we're going to have all these clue tokens going to the graveyard and being sacked around. So we have the ability to just make this Snuffler really, really big and into a threat. And we do have other ways of making things unblockable and doing other dumb stuff. So this might actually do some mileage for us because it's going to have to be blocked by our opponents eventually. And the last category of cards we're going to add is some enchantments to this deck. Let's start off with Buried in the Garden. For 2, a green and a white, you get an enchantment aura, enchant land. Buried in the Garden enters the battlefield. Exile target non-land permanent you don't control until it leaves the battlefield. And then whenever an enchanted land is tapped for mana, it produces an additional 1 mana of any color. So we have the ability to essentially ossify one of our opponent's permanents. Doesn't have to be a creature like ossification. But in this case, we get to exile it, and it won't go anywhere until they either disenchant this stuff or blow the land up, which is less likely to happen. And then that land also then basically gives us double mana for the rest of the game while this is on the board. We're also going to include 2 of the new case cards. The first one that we're including is Case of the Filched Falcon for a blue. When this case enters the battlefield, investigate. Perfectly on theme here. You control 3 or more artifacts to solve it. Great. And then solved, 2 in a blue, sack the case. Put 4+1/+ counters on target non-creature artifact, and it becomes a 0/0 bird creature with flying in addition to its other types. So we can turn any of our clues or mana rocks into a 4/4 bird that can help us win the game. And then the other case we're going to include is the Case of the Pilfered Proof for 1 and a white. Whenever a detective enters the battlefield under your control, and whenever a detective you control is turned face up, you put a counter on it, which is great because we have a bunch of detectives in the deck. To solve it, you have to control 3 or more detectives. Great. And then solved, if 1 or more tokens would be created under your control, those tokens plus a clue are created instead. And that includes the clues that we're generating off of other stuff anyways. So if you can solve this, you're getting 2 clues for every investigate instance. And then the last of the cards from the new set we're going to add, I still got a couple more from older stuff. Proph's Eidetic Memory for 1 and a blue legendary enchantment. When it enters, draw a card, you have no max hand size. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you've drawn more than 1 card this turn, put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, where X is the number of cards you've drawn this turn, -1. So we have the ability to crack some clues in the first main phase, and then have a bunch of counters dumped onto Morska or one of our other threats, and just makes for a great time for this card. And the next card, we're going to dip into a card that came in for the Blame Game deck that I did. Holy Mantle for 2 white, enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and has protection from creatures. So this is a great way to make Morska unblockable and be able to go ahead and slam home that commander damage, and so they can't block it or hit it with any of the abilities they may have. And the last card I'm going to add into this deck is a replacement for Adrixin Niv in Doubling Season. Yes, that Doubling Season. That card was originally printed in Ravnica, and the 2 copies of this that I own came from the Ravnica set. So for 4 and a green, if an effect would put 1 or more tokens into play under your control, you get twice that many instead. If an effect would place 1 or more counters on a permanent you control, it places twice that many on that permanent instead. This is so much better than Adrix's Nev because it only affected tokens, whereas this affects the counters. So not only are you getting double the clue tokens, the +1/+1 counters going onto Morska are also going to be doubled. So it's going to spiral out of control and put the pressure on your opponents much faster if this hits the board. So those were my thematic upgrades for Deep Clue C. What did you guys think? Is there something I should have put in here that I didn't? Did I put something in here that I shouldn't have? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're down here, if you like what I'm doing and want to be informed when the next video comes up, please feel free to subscribe and it'll let you know when I'm posting. As always, thank you for watching and have a great day.